Yeah, there's two Rossellini films on the Vatican film list. The other one being Rome Open City, which we'll get to later on. And I expect that we'll probably end up discussing more Rossellini films than just those two on this podcast because of the way that, despite being non-religious and even a professed atheist at certain points in his life, his films are very concerned with morality and religion, from what I understand. Although this is my first sort of like regular feature film that I've seen by him. So I don't know. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Rossellini. I know you've seen a lot of his work, so.
Yeah, sure. So Roberto Rossellini became prominent in the Italian film world around the end of World War II with a movement that's commonly known as neorealism. I believe you guys have talked about it already on the show with Bicycle Thieves and perhaps other films. So he's part of this groundswell of Italian filmmakers who are basically, they're taking their cameras into the streets. They're not shooting on studio sets. They're trying to shoot in real places with non-actors. And, you know, it results in this more kind of on the ground, closer to reality effect. That's the goal, at least. And this kind of movement became very, very influential for other filmmakers in other countries, especially the French New Wave. And so many of the filmmakers of the French New Wave, which would come to fruition, you know, at the end of the 1950s and the 1960s, they were critics and cinephiles who were watching these neorealist films as they came out in the 40s and early 50s. So Rossellini is, in a lot of ways, you could say though he isn't the genesis of the movement, that there's a couple other people who are more kind of at the center of that, but he is the one who kind of is best known. I guess you could make an argument for Vittorio De Sica as well. But Rossellini is at the heart of it. And so there's so much that could be said about him, so I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible. But basically, he's very famous for starting in neorealism and these very, you know, gritty, on-the-ground films. Filmmaking, he makes his war trilogy, starting with Rome Open City in 1944, 45, I believe. That has a massive kind of effect in just its influence in taking, you know, film away from the artifice and towards something more real. And then he makes a couple other films in that trilogy. But once he's finished the war trilogy, he starts to move in a different direction. And Flowers of St. Francis is kind of like an interesting kind of bridge work in this world. He starts to, he doesn't depart from his kind of neorealist desires, if you will, but he starts to move in a bit of a more artificial, a bit more staged kind of direction. And in one way, one particular aspect of that is he goes into a more melodramatic kind of direction. So one of his other very famous trilogies is with the Hollywood actress Ingrid Bergman, who he ended up having a personal, like an actual relationship with, which was quite a scandal at the time. So there's lots of Wikipedia that you can check out on that. But he made this trilogy with her that was basically like a spiritual quest. 3 films: Stromboli, Europa 51, and Journey to Italy, or Voyage to Italy. And these are all films that star Ingrid Bergman, and they're all kind of have these very, very like deep spiritual kind of yearnings at the heart of them. It's about characters who are kind of searching for transcendence and transcendent truth. And they're probably Rossellini's most explicitly Christian films, in that they are, part of really engaging in this spiritual quest. And Rossellini, being Italian, he would say, I believe later in his life, that, when people would approach him and say, your films are very spiritual, and he would sort of say, no, I'm not religious, but I am Italian. And, Roman Catholicism is obviously baked into the character of being Italian. So last thing I'll just mention about him is that, he has these stages of his career. He starts in he starts in neorealism. He kind of moves into something more kind of like, artificial, or a bit more obviously produced, so like something more melodramatic, and he gets into this spiritual quest kind of mode. But then he kind of shifts again. In the 60s, he kind of loses faith in film as a dramatic medium, and he turns to television. And it's quite a remarkable thing, because I don't think you can take another filmmaker who's done quite the turn that he did, which is he basically stopped making dramatic films that, kind of have like emotions. And he started making what's been called in retrospect, these history films, where he became fascinated with looking at significant moments in history, such as like the age of the Medici in the Florence in the 15th century, or looking at the lives of various philosophers like Blaise Pascal or René Descartes or Socrates. and he produces these films that are set in that time, and they have these sort of simple but period piece sets and actors and costumes and everything. But there's no emotion, there's no real expression. Everything is kind of stripped of its feeling, but he's trying to kind of express the like intellectual kind of like backbone of how these moments, how these historical figures, and because he focuses a lot on like scientists and philosophers, it's a lot of talking, and honestly, they're fascinating films. They're frustrating. They're not easy to watch, but they are also, there's something kind of strangely hypnotic about them.
Yeah, I've seen the first things I ever watched by Rossellini was the 3-part Age of the Medici series, and it's quite charming. It's like a docudrama without really drama, but sort of actors in really cool sets and costumes, but not making any attempt to be dramatic. It's also kind of odd because it was originally made for this piece, which was originally made for English television, and then like that got canceled, so they decided to put on in Italy, and so they had to dub like the English dialogue into Italian. It was just like this whole thing, but it's very odd because it's quite interesting, even though they're not trying to be dramatic, and the actors are just delivering this like information, almost like you would at a, like if you went to like somebody who was doing an impression of Ben Franklin,
or like a reenactment.
Like answering questions. It's like they're saying things they would have no reason to say out loud to each other, and it's just quite like there's no attempt to get around that because it's not trying to be a drama. It's just interesting. It's like strangely charming, and
it's just moments happening, and so that's where Rossellini kind of ended his career, was in this very sort of stripped down scientific look at history. But you can sort of see Flowers of St. Francis is a really interesting film to discuss for him, because it kind of actually starts to bring, honestly, it actually ties, it largely ties together the first chapter of his career, which is, neorealism, and the final chapter, which is these history films.
I agree. Yeah, this film, like, there's definitely a kinship between this and the later docudrama work that I've seen, just in this sort of like, just like very straightforwardness. It's not trying to be dramatic for the most part. It's just like the way the actors deliver their lines, because they're in this case, because they're non-actors. I think in the case of the docudrama, they are actors, but they're just delivering it in a non-dramatic way, and so it actually ends up having like a slightly similar effect.